Who Gets to Decide? A liberty-based podcast that brings a little piece of sanity to a confused society drowning in a culture of craziness. And here is your host, Seth Martin.
Well, all right. What's up, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Who Gets to Decide. This is Seth Martin, your host, and this is episode 640. Let's get that to go away so you can see my face. Thank you guys for joining me this evening. Glad you're here, and always happy you're listening. Well, as most of you already know by this point, there was another huge dump of the Epstein files. Some 3 million, maybe 3.5 million documents have been released, and it's way too soon, really, still now to say what this is or really talk too much about it and start talking indictments and criminal prosecutions and things like that. But there is some information that's there, and Tucker Carlson is someone I trust. Ian Carroll is someone I trust, and they're very cautious and they're speaking about this. But I thought it would be good to at least have some sort of preliminary show about this topic and discuss some of the more well-known things that conspiracy theories. This is what I love about the whole conspiracy theory thing. Really, a conspiracy theory is just a theory that comes true after enough time passes and more information comes out. A lot of these people that come up with these conspiracy theories actually have really good circumstantial evidence to piece together what they're telling us. And when you go on mainstream media and somebody brings it up and they label you a conspiracy theorist, really what they're saying is they're just too lazy to go dig into it, or they're bought off by the mainstream media or the power center within government or whatever. You know, they don't want to lose their contact at the CIA or the Department of Justice or whatever. And so I'm really getting sick and tired about hearing, about people calling things conspiracy theories. I mean, it's like when everybody was racist, everybody was running around calling people racist. Well, if you call everybody racist, well, then what is racism? What does the word mean at that point? What does the word racist mean? If everybody's racist, that means nobody is, right? It's the same thing with conspiracy theories. If everything in the news is something you don't like and you call it a conspiracy theory, then what is a conspiracy theory really? It loses its meaning, right? But the Epstein, we've done numerous shows on Epstein and talked about what it could be and why it's so important, right? We've talked about how we supposedly have this government of, for, and by the people. And what that means is that the people's, to the extent you could somehow measure what the people want collectively, like how do you measure what the people want? I'm holding up air fingers quotes. That's a very difficult thing to do, but the idea is, we vote for our representatives and then they represent us. And if we send people there, they're supposed to represent our thinking or get some understanding of what, quote unquote, the people want. But what we've noticed is it doesn't go that way, right? We don't want our as an example, most people don't want our politicians front-running trades around government business and becoming multimillionaires, okay? But we haven't been able to stop it, okay? So what does that mean? Does that mean, what it means to me is that we're not a government of, for, and by the people. We're some sort of plutocracy or something. I don't know. And so to me, this whole Epstein thing really brings a lot of explanation to why this is. Why is it that we don't get what we vote for? Why is it that we the people don't seem to be in charge of the government? Why this cabal of people that are willing to break the law, they're willing to traffic children and, perform satanic rituals and drink their blood and all this other crazy shit. Why does that persist instead of what, we actually need from a government, which is, low taxes, a decent set of basic services where in those types of areas where free riding takes place, like trash pickup. you collect a little bit of taxes for trash pickup, right? Because everybody needs their trash picked up. So why is it that we can't seem to get our government to do the things we want them to do? Why is it that they're so focused on agitating for war in Ukraine or in Iraq or Iran or Syria or some other place? Why? I mean, nobody in America is clamoring for that. Nobody's marching in the streets saying, we want to invade Iran, death to Iran. Nobody's doing anything like that. But those are the types of policies that persist. And this is very peculiar. This is a very strange dynamic in our political system. And more than anything, the Epstein situation seems to pick the lock for the solution there, like what's really behind all this. And so this interview with Ian Carroll is quite long, and we're not going to play all of it. We're going to play a lot, but we're not going to play all of it. I encourage you to go listen to it. It's very, very good. But I wanted to highlight things like the financial crisis, a little bit around Pizzagate, although I'd cut a lot of that out. And then there's some other aspects here, the trafficking, the criminal element, the mob element, the mafioso element of all this. And if you read Whitney Webb, for example, you learn that all of this stuff that Epstein was involved with, it all grew out of the mafia and the CIA's connection to the mafia. Well, I don't know if y'all have ever seen, there's a great movie. It's really funny. It's with Mark Wahlberg and Denzel Washington. And I can't think of the name of the movie, but he's a naval officer, Mark Wahlberg is, and Denzel Washington is like a DEA cop, and some guys in the Navy intelligence want to rob this bank. Well, they steal this money that belongs to the CIA. And I don't think they realized it at the time. They didn't realize it was the CIA's money, but it was a lot of money. And so the question is, you watch a movie like that, why does the CIA have all that money? Well, because they have all these deals going through like the mafia, and they're running drugs and things like that to raise money so they can go fight little private wars and stir up wars in faraway places and stuff. And so the CIA has been doing this for decades, okay? I mean, and it's part of the U.S. government. And so Epstein seems to have been a part of all that in some way. And it's still very fuzzy because the government has released a bunch of information. Some of the information they've released is probably not true, to kind of throw people off the scent. Who knows? I mean, who really knows what's going on here? But the bottom line is, it doesn't have anything to do with what we learned in 8th grade history about what America is and what the function of American government is supposed to be. And to me, this is the critical aspect of it. I'm not particularly interested in human trafficking. I think it's vile and disgusting, and we should put a stop to it. I'm not particularly interested in the CIA's activities to foment war overseas or even inside the United States. I'm not interested in any of those things. But what I am interested in is liberty. And these things all seem to run counter to liberty. And this is why I think the Epstein story is so vitally important. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start. This first clip is about the sexual, religious, ritual nature of what's going on here. And this is disgusting and crazy. And 15 years ago or 10 years ago even, I might have even gone, no, that's got to be a conspiracy theory, all right? But there's just weird stuff. There's imagery. There's, just a lot of weird stuff going on here. So I'll let Ian Carroll talk about it because he's kind of not the expert, but he's done a lot of research on this, and I trust the guy. I think he's doing a good job.
The implication of this and a lot of other things in this file dump is that there are basically religious rituals, sexual in nature. That's very common through history. There were temple prostitutes for a reason. There are rituals involving children underway in the United States and the West, rich and powerful people sexually abusing young people. That is very hard for a lot of people to believe or metabolize, but it feels like that's not totally crazy. Like that happens. Does that happen?
I mean, absolutely. It's it's so dark that it's hard for average people, regular
Right,
people
right.
that are just trying to live their lives to even approach it. And even imagine, like, you cannot put yourselves in the shoes of someone so depraved. And honestly, like, regular Americans can't even put themselves in the shoes of a millionaire, let alone a billionaire, because like
Right.
they're just trying to pay their bills and they can't because the billionaires are, doing these billionaires at least are doing certain things that are messing everything up. But so it's so far removed from our regular experience that it's hard to understand and believe. But it is there's been good evidence of elements of that in various kind of fringe investigations for a long time. And I don't say fringe to mean they're unreliable. I mean fringe to say that they just never get traction with the mainstream media for whatever reason.
Right.
But it's right there in these emails and in these files. And it's not entirely clear what all of it means, but there's very overt references, there's covert references, and there's just mounting because people are still digging through them. These are millions of files and no effective way to sort through them the way that the DOJ put them out. And so the evidence is mounting more and more that we have everything in these files from people that were turning a blind eye, which is also reprehensible, people that were adjacent and complicit, people that were directly complicit, people that were straight up evil and disgusting, and then people that venture into the demonic or the truly depraved. And people that have been following this story have known for a long time that unfortunately that's always been a part of it. And we've had evidence that that's a part of it for a long time. And that's true of most all human trafficking networks. The people that are doing human trafficking by their nature are some of the most depraved people on this planet. And it's an enormous industry and it's not getting any smaller. And it's tragic that it takes something so overt as this massive blackmail ring apparently blowing up in the middle of the United States government and across the entire world, and then trailing out in a 10-year long cover up, almost 7-year long cover up, for people to even like confront that this is happening. But it's definitely happening. Not everyone in the files is, participating in ritualistic sacrifices or anything like that.
Right.
And there are fake things in the files that are,
Yes.
for whatever reason in there. Like, for one example, one that went very viral is there's an image in the files of a cutting board with chickens on it and like a black box censored out, but there's like a foot sticking out and it's obviously a baby's foot. And the implication is that it's a cutting board with some chickens and like a baby and they're going to carve it up and eat it. By my understanding, that is a fake image. It's kind of hard to tell what's real and what's fake at this point, but there's stuff like that in there that's like, so there's just a lot of really messed up stuff in there, but there's also a lot of people running away with a little tidbit for views or clicks or likes or whatever it is. And so it's really important that people pump the brakes, slow down, and go to the original source files and look for people that are citing their sources on the files that they're referencing. And when they make definitive claims, they show you the files that they're talking about, because a lot of people are making claims that are actually objectively untrue or are based on a small morsel that has been blown up into a whole meal of great content, but not necessarily great journalism.
All right. Yeah, I know that clip was long, and these clips are going to be long, okay? Because there's a stream of thought here that's important to get out, and I don't want to chop it all up and make it hard for somebody to absorb. But yeah, I think when people read things like Thomas Jefferson or James Madison, and they read about how the people are supposed to hold the government accountable, I don't think they were talking about this kind of thing, right? They weren't talking about, hey, because some of your leaders, they could just be devil worshiping, human sacrificing, evil people, and you need to really keep an eye on them. I don't think anybody was thinking that. I think they were thinking about like, hey, don't encroach on the First Amendment, or hey, don't, make sure you don't encroach on the Fourth Amendment, and we're securing our papers, and you need a search warrant and things like this. But this just goes to show you how far afield, the United States government has gone. I know on this show we talk a lot about money and honest money, but you can, this is just a great example of how dishonest money so fully corrupts the system and attracts the worst of the worst people. And who's behind it? For what purpose is this all going on? And who's implicated? Tucker Carlson's going to talk about that in the next clip. But and to what damage? Like how concerned do we need to be about this? I mean, I think we need to be very concerned, because I think it's interfered with the whole agency that we have with representative government. Your representative is your agent, okay? And on the average, each representative represents about 600,000 people. So that means that, a congressman or a congresswoman is an agent for about 600,000 people. There seems to be a competing agency, right? A relationship. Like there's, whether it be Israel, the state of Israel, through its donations to congressmen and congresswomen and senators, where they're controlling, that drives a wedge into this representated relationship, right? If I'm in Congress and I'm supposed to represent 600,000 people that live in my district, but I actually represent the Israeli government because they fund my campaigns and all this kind of stuff, and I do their bidding in the House of Representatives and make sure I vote for the wars they want, for the military support that they want, for other things that they want. Well, then you can easily see there how the 600,000 people that I'm supposed to represent have just been kind of kicked to the curb, which is exactly what has happened in America. So to me, we need to get to the bottom of this like yesterday. But we do have to wrap our heads around the depravity here and how severe it is, and how some people are just going to go, oh, I don't believe that. How could our representatives and people in Hollywood and other people that are compromised in our cultural or otherwise cultural kind of sphere, how could they be drinking children's blood, adrenalized, adrenochrome laden blood? How could that possibly be? That just sounds like science fiction. So there is a level of having to get your head around this extreme level of depravity in a way to even start to consider what the hell we're talking about here. I mean, this is the difficulty of this subject, but it's vitally important that we get to the bottom of it. And I know Donald Trump wants to protect maybe himself and also his billionaire friends, but this needs to end during his term. I mean, we need to get a stop to this now, because likely what's going to happen is the next person that gets elected is just not going to have the political will to do it. And look, Donald Trump's 80 years old. I mean, who cares? He may get assassinated during this, and that would be unfortunate. But he's 80 years old. He's lived a full life. He's got a big family, and he has a lot to be proud of in his life. I just think he needs to take some personal risk here and do an about face and really push hard for this to come out. All right, let's go to the next clip here.
I'm really almost overwhelmed by the cover-up of it and by the people I know who participated in that. And I'll just name two of them. One is Bill Barr, who's the two-time Republican Attorney General, whose father, by the way, started Jeffrey Epstein's career. His father, Donald Barr, was a former OSS CIA officer. In the files, I should also say that Jeffrey Epstein describes Bill Barr, the former AG, as, quote, CIA. Jeffrey Epstein privately says this guy's CIA. Bill Barr covered up Epstein's murder. He was clearly murdered in federal detention. Barr said out loud, we got to make sure everyone thinks this is a suicide. So why isn't he being asked about this? And the second is Mike Pompeo. And Mike Pompeo was caught plotting to murder Julian Assange, the head of WikiLeaks. Why is this significant? Well, because it was WikiLeaks that made that first tranche of emails available to the public. And it was Julian Assange who said on camera, basically said, my source, he didn't say this, he didn't say my source, but he heavily suggested in an interview with Dutch television. My source was Seth Rich, the DNC staffer who was found murdered on the street in Washington in a so-called robbery where nothing was taken from him. That investigation was taken over by the FBI. What? Why? And Assange goes on Dutch television and says, I can't see who my sources are, but they face great risks. You can pull up the interview right now and look at it. Mm-hmm. And then he points to Seth Rich. And the interviewer's like, wait, are you saying Seth Rich was murdered for this? And Assange is like, look, I can't tell you who my sources are, but my sources take great risks. Seth Rich just got murdered. That couldn't be clearer, right? It was right after that Julian Assange was incarcerated, first in an embassy in London and then in Belmarsh prison, never charged with a crime. And that was pushed by CIA and Mike Pompeo. And it's like, wait a second. Shouldn't someone ask Mike Pompeo? Like, what is this? What is this? These are real allegations. They're credible allegations. And rather than follow up, you're punishing the guy who brought them to light? Tell us how that works, Mike Pompeo. Mike Pompeo's like wandering free. And no one asks him about this. Like, what is going on, Ian Carroll?
Every time I talk about this story, every aspect of the story from Pizzagate to Epstein, everything in between, I always have to try not to get angry because when you think about, especially for me, the cover up, it makes me so furious how regular Americans are going to jail over like smoking a joint or going to jail over like paying taxes that are getting sent overseas anyways, or going to jail over a parking ticket they can't afford, whatever it is, this madness in this country where we are lawfared to death. But these obvious criminals and these people that we at least have obvious questions for are just walking free. And you bring up two really great points that, I mean, in both cases, I think it's obvious that those actions are being taken on behalf of whatever criminal organizations or happenings are being exposed. For example, in those email dumps that Seth Rich probably leaked, because it wasn't just Pizzagate stuff. It was also all sorts of Benghazi stuff, all sorts of Hillary Clinton stuff, all sorts of other really serious stuff that also was never asked of the appropriate parties. But I mean, when you start talking about who's still walking free that we should be asking questions of, and we're looking at the Epstein investigation, that list immediately grows to like 100 miles long. And we got in one of the document drops that happened a couple weeks ago, and then we re-corroborated it multiple times since then. We got a list of 10 co-conspirators that they have had for years from one of their old investigations that just never happened because Kash Patel has been telling us there are no co-conspirators, there is no organization, it was just him alone. But we've got a document saying that they had 10 co-conspirators, one of whom was Leslie Wexner. They're named. And that the list is long. Like there's pilots, we know their names, Larry Visosky, there's 3 different pilots. There's a bunch of other madams like Ghislaine Maxwell, but assistants that were helping to recruit girls. There's a bunch of other people that were trafficking models and bringing models in and out. There's just an enormously long list of people in various roles all around Epstein that we know full well were at the very least deeply suspiciously involved, where they should be asked some very serious questions. I mean, right up to Ehud Barak, who by my accounting looks like the handler of Epstein. He certainly looks like we have all these emails from both Ehud Barak's email server now and from Jeffrey Epstein's trove of documents that corroborate them doing what looks like intelligence operations all around the world and in the United States. So there's just an endless number of people that, like you were saying earlier, that we could at least investigate because it's in the name, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And they keep on giving us this line as though like, well, we've got emails, but it's not illegal to party with Jeffrey Epstein. And it's like, we're not asking you to read the emails. We're asking you to investigate all of the myriad suspicious things that are documented here in these files and emails. And instead of getting investigation, we're getting what looks like cover up, denial, distraction, anything but investigation. And it kind of makes you wonder why.
Yeah, it sure does. And, these are people that hold high office. I mean, Mike Pompeo has been in government his whole life and has held large, big offices in various cabinets in the first Trump White House and I noticed Trump didn't bring him in this time because he's just a creep. He's a spook and just weird, and never saw a war that he wasn't willing to send your children to. And people like Bill Barr, who Jeffrey Epstein himself said was CIA. And he was the attorney general. What is that? The attorney general is also in the CIA. That just doesn't seem quite right. I don't know. There's a lot of stuff here. And to Ian Carroll's point, we're not, when I say we, kind of speaking for everybody, but people aren't asking for immediate indictments or something. We're asking you to go investigate these things. There's real credible information that these people are compromised in a way that keeps them from doing their job the way the American people want them to do their job. And we want you to go investigate it. But then you get Kash Patel, like he said it there at the end. Well, it's not against the law to party with Jeffrey Epstein. What the hell are you talking about, dude? It's just, if you get into a discussion, back when I was growing up, people used to talk about, well, what is government? How do you have a good government versus bad government? And people would say things like, well, you have a universal suffrage, and you have a certain set of rights that are inalienable, and then you have institutions that uphold those rights, that enforce those rights. When I look around at America right now, our institutions are doing none of that. Our institutions are in on the corruption. They're part of the problem. And this is why, nowadays when the FBI stands up and says something, people are just going, well, that's bullshit. They're not even considering it. Some people are. So there's a whole bunch of people that are still walking around like zombies, fully asleep. But, we talked about the Charlie Kirk assassination. Look at that. That guy that they said did it jumped off the roof. There's no gun in his hand. There's no gun that he throws off the roof first and then jumps down. There's just no gun. So somehow a gun got from the roof where he's allegedly shot it, and then it left the roof somehow and ended up in this backyard 2 miles away or whatever. But we don't see that guy carrying it, and they don't show us a picture of another guy, so it's not a conspiracy. It's shoddy work, And I guess either people are so, what's the word? I can't think of the word, but they're just so asleep to the fact that they're just not even really checking in on these details. And these institutions are just outright lying to us now. They're not even trying to keep it legitimate looking. And Tucker just brought up two really good examples. I remember when this Seth Rich murder happened. In fact, I don't know what the show numbers are, but you can go back. We did a couple of shows on Seth Rich, and we talked about how there's people out there that have, first of all, the servers at the DNC were never turned over to the FBI. But the files that got leaked to WikiLeaks, apparently, if you go through the internet and steal files, those files have a different signature or different file look to them or something. I'm not a technical guy, so I don't know. Than if you just use, let's say, a portable hard drive or a flash drive. And apparently, there are people out there that have looked at these files because WikiLeaks published them all. Okay, they're out there. And there's some sort of digital signature that shows that they were not downloaded through the internet. They were downloaded directly from a server, from an email server. Okay, so that tells you right there that Russia didn't hack the DNC, but that's still the narrative. Anytime this ever comes up on TV, Russia hacked the DNC and stole a bunch of proprietary information and what Pizzagate, there's nothing going on, nothing to see there, and all this kind of stuff. Meanwhile, you got Mike Pompeo trying to murder Julian Assange by getting him back to America and putting him on trial for treason, which is punishable by death. And it's like, what the hell is that? Why can't we look at that and understand what really happened there? And the answer is just a bunch of people don't want you to know. And the reason they don't want you to know, because somebody's going to show them, if they tell, somebody will show them screwing some 13-year-old on video. And well, they don't want that out. And so you just got this, this blackmail thing is causing all these people to do unexplainable things to cover up crimes that are just ongoing, nonstop ongoing in America that benefit the powerful, that benefit the rich. It's not going to end well. I mean, the best thing that we could do is just have all this come out, everybody acknowledge it. We do this giant perp walk and get rid of all these people, banish them from government forever, maybe even build a special prison so that they can all hang out with each other in prison and kill each other if that's what they want to do, but just remove them from polite society completely. And that would be the best thing for America. Then you could go, okay, we got rid of everybody. Now we can get back to, what the 8th grade history books say about the way the American government is supposed to, operate. All right, let me jump into this next clip. And this next one is about Jeffrey Epstein's involvement in the financial crisis, which is significant. I mean, that ruined a lot of people's lives. And this guy was at the center of it. And nobody really knows about that. And that's tragic, actually.
Jeffrey Epstein's involvement or intersection with the global financial crisis. What's that?
Well, the intersection with the global financial crisis specifically is a wild story that, to be truly told, you need to put the evidence on screen as well. But the short version is that he had a company called Liquid Funding Limited that was domiciled in the Bahamas, that was partially owned by Bear Stearns. And Bear Stearns, is where he had come up for a long time. And Liquid Funding Limited was selling CDOs, the same types of CDOs that eventually caused the global financial crisis. It was capitalized at, I believe, $100 million and allowed to sell 20 billion with a B of CDOs. And I actually just was looking at that statistic earlier today because this is the craziest story. And that little CDO factory that Jeffrey Epstein was running tied into Bear Stearns. And if you recall, Bear Stearns was one of the first to collapse, right? That shut down in the months directly preceding Bear Stearns starting to collapse. And Jeffrey Epstein redeemed all of those CDOs, all of those assets. The terms are, I don't know the technical terms for what he did, but basically he made a run on the bank on those exact assets that were the exact problem. And he was tied into the exact bank that was financially distressed. And then he wound that whole company, Liquid Funding Limited, up and disappeared. And
all right, let me give you a little context here before we move on. A CDO stands for collateralized debt obligation. So what these banks did, I think we've talked about this before, but 100 years ago, if you went and borrowed money from a bank to buy a house, the mortgage, all the documents you would sign would be in that bank and it would be on the balance sheet. Now what they do is they paper these things up and they sell them to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And then Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac run a market called the mortgage-backed security market. Okay. And just think of it like stock. People are trading mortgages back and forth, because what the banks have gotten, what they've started doing, instead of being tied down with mortgages that are just always on their balance sheet, what they do is they sell off some or they buy some depending on the way their balance sheet looks that day. Okay. And so it's constantly changing. Well, what the big money center banks did is when, the rating agencies rated these things AAA and AAA plus and stuff like that. What the banks did is they sold what's called a CDO. And a CDO is basically like insurance in case the bond fails. Okay, the underlying bond fails. And so what they did is they sold all this. So they were obligated. So if the bond fails, the banks were obligated. But what it did is it paid them like 4% a year. And it was generally perceived that the housing market was not that much risk. So houses were just always going to go up, and nobody was ever worried about See, if I'm getting 4% a year, that means I can lose 96% in 1 year. But these banks were just taking this 4% a year on all these CDOs, and they had millions of CDOs they were selling. And this, if you ever saw the movie The Big Short, that's what those guys, like Mike Burry, when he came into Goldman Sachs, he goes, "I want to buy some of your CDOs." And they're like, "Why?" And he goes, "Because I think the housing market's going to collapse." And they're like, "Oh, okay, great. We'll sell some CDOs to this guy." And they sold him a bunch of CDOs, right? Well, he was on the other side of that trade, right? So instead of getting 4% a year, he was having to pay the 4% a year. But when those obligations came due and Goldman Sachs had to pony up and pay, they're paying Mike Burry billions and billions of dollars. So anyway, that's how the CDO thing went. But Jeffrey Epstein, in the way Ian Carroll just described it, was the bank. He was representing, I'm holding up Bear Fingers quotes, Bear Stearns. He had an arm of Bear Stearns called Liquid Funding, or whatever it was called. And he sold about $20 billion worth of these CDOs. But he got out before the bill came due. That's what Ian Carroll was saying. So, and he was able to dissolve the company and everything. I mean, he was able to get completely out of it. He was sophisticated enough to know that he was on the wrong side of that trade, and he was going to lose all his money if he didn't get out of that. So, you literally have Jeffrey Epstein at the center. He was doing the same thing that Goldman Sachs and these other big banks, Citibank and all these other big money center banks were doing during the financial crisis, which almost collapsed the U.S. economy, which should have collapsed the U.S. economy. In fact, we'd probably be better off today had we let it collapse at that time. But of course, as you know, everybody famously knows, the government printed up a bunch of money and bailed out the banks. And Jeffrey Epstein continued to be rich, and this problem presumably just got worse and worse until eventually he was arrested. And they're going to talk about it in a minute about why was Jeffrey Epstein involved in this financial stuff? What was he there's been a lot of speculation about it. Is he a financier? Is he one of these brilliant financiers? I'm holding up Air Fingers quotes. No, he wasn't. He was always a criminal. But he had a good mind for how to do complicated transactions and keep them off the books and things like that. And that's what people paid him to do. All right, let's continue here.
And later, JP Morgan, the bank that he later worked with after, Bear Stearns was his early banking career. And then he later was doing all of his money laundering and banking and referring of people at JP Morgan. They came in, swooped up Bear Stearns for pennies on the dollar. They also later spun Liquid Funding Limited back up. There's a very overt financial paper trail that Jeffrey Epstein was better acquainted with the problem than almost anyone in the world, because he was deeply enmeshed in Bear Stearns and knew the leadership of Bear Stearns very well. And he understood CDOs and he was selling CDOs. And then he just so happens to wind his whole shop up and close it down and redeem it all right at the moment when things are about to go bust. So that's a wild rabbit hole and it's very interesting. But
I mean, what is it? I mean, that suggests, well, it doesn't suggest, it's like direct evidence of, if I'm assuming we can verify what you're saying, that like the biggest events in the world are actually not quite as organic or accidental as we're led to believe. And that, this is like puppet master stuff. It is. I don't know what to say. I don't want this to be true, but that's what it looks like.
Yeah. And the reason why I feel comfortable saying that is because I actually did produce an entire YouTube video on teleprompter with my sources directly in front of my face. They're on screen. It's on my YouTube right now.
Yes.
I think it's titled Jeffrey Epstein Knew, or He Knew. And I put it out middle to late last year and walked through document by document. Not that we know for sure, not that he schemed it with his Illuminati buddies, but he was right at the heart of it, had all the knowledge of it. He was deeply connected to all the parties in it. And then the timing is just so coincidental. And yeah, it does start to make you wonder about how much of our global events are orchestrated versus not. But then, you think about the global pandemic and you think about we've got documents in the Epstein files that they're talking about getting a war in Ukraine started and how that's going to be good for business. And so these files have a lot of these world events sort of woven throughout them, either directly or indirectly. It's sometimes hard to say. But the reason I think why Jeffrey Epstein is at the center of so many of these things and at the center of so many circles and at the center of so many important and powerful networks in our world is because Jeffrey Epstein was a professional money launderer. There's this facade as though we don't know how Jeffrey Epstein made his money. And then there's also a lot of people that will erroneously report that Jeffrey Epstein made his money in legitimate ways, but then, got into crime or whatever. It's like that is not true. Jeffrey Epstein went from legitimate-ish banking at Bear Stearns, where he was managing private wealth for clients. And then in the 80s, he went into his missing years where he said that he was a bounty hunter for billionaires. But we have lots and lots of evidence that during that time, he was working with arms traffickers, Douglas Lease, Anand Khashoggi, and Robert Maxwell, and getting into money laundering for arms dealers because he was exceptionally good at complex financial transactions, using derivatives, using tax havens, using charitable structures of complex charitable organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Clinton Global Initiative. And he got better and better throughout his career at basically committing complex financial frauds, like the Tower Financials fraud that he was a major part of. And so when you get to the end of that line and he is getting into the actual human trafficking side of it, the blackmailing side of it, money launderers are the node that all criminal networks have to flow through. Money laundering is the network, the node that because it's not just like money laundering for criminal stuff. It's also if a billionaire wants to shelter their taxes or wants to pay less in taxes. And you can read the reporting about how Jeffrey Epstein referred Bill Gates and Sergey Brin and Benjamin Netanyahu and Larry Summers to JP Morgan for banking services. He referred a bunch of the wealthiest, most powerful people in the world to JP Morgan for banking services, right? Which is completely nonsensical if you take it at face value. But when you realize that that's like how when you're in high school and you need to know the guy that knows the weed dealer in order to get into the back door, it's like you need that trust network in a criminal space because criminals have to operate on trust. And so that it's like, a guy that knows a guy to get you in the back door for the back door of the banking system is what that looks like to me. And who would know that better than Jeffrey Epstein? And so there's this false narrative that we don't know how he made his money. We don't know what the network, we don't know. And what that means is that those people have not read what we do know. And there's a lot we still don't know. But how Jeffrey Epstein made his money and why he was at the center of so much is not the great mystery that it once was anymore.
Okay. Yeah. One thing I want to bring up, this is all pretty much self-explanatory, but the one thing I do want to bring up is, I vividly remember the financial crisis, and they talked about how this was a market failure, and I'm sitting there going, yeah, I don't think so. But this is the way they do it, right? The government blows something up, and then they say, well, the market kind of, this was kind of a market failure because the market, the rating agencies were doing this and the banks weren't considering, they didn't have all their money at risk. They had counterparty risk and all these kinds of things. And so this is really a market failure. No, you can clearly hear from this, it wasn't a market failure. It was a robbery. Okay. The financial crisis was just a giant robbery. That's all it was. People like Jeffrey Epstein and his banker buddies at JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs and all these places, they took trades that presented an unlimited amount of risk, okay, to them, and then made all the money in the years preceding that. They made all the money from those trades, and when the trades blew up, they went to the government and said, "Hey, Wall Street's going to fail unless you can bail us out. But, Main Street's going to fail unless you can bail out Wall Street." And somehow that's a market failure. No, it's no different than if you were, selling futures on oil, and oil, because you think future, price of oil is going to go down, but it actually goes up by like $10,000 and it wipes you completely out. Yeah, you took an unlimited amount of risk and it went against you. Okay, that's essentially what happened in the financial crisis. But the important point is, people like Jeffrey Epstein was at the center of all this. He was the one around telling people to, oh yeah, sell CDOs and sell a bunch of CDOs and you'll make a bunch of money, and all this kind of stuff. He was advising people to do that, and the banks were doing it. He was doing it. They were all doing it and making money. And then he had the fortunate timing to close all his exposure down before the whole thing blew up. But the damage was done, right? I mean, we all saw what happened. But yeah, I think I think it's on Netflix. There's a Jeffrey Epstein documentary, and they talk about him being a financier and how he made money early in his career, and then did exactly what Ian Carroll's talking about. Oh, and then he kind of started dabbling in criminality. And I think Ian Carroll's right. No, I think he was a criminal from the get-go. He was associated with the CIA. He was raising money for the CIA. You're going to hear more about something. We're not going to talk about it today, but you're going to hear more and more about something called BCCI. BCCI was his client, and he was raising money for this. And this is just all criminal activity from the very beginning. Yeah, I definitely agree with Ian Carroll that we don't have to speculate about how Jeffrey Epstein became wealthy. He became wealthy because he stole it. He stole everything he had. All right, let's jump into this next clip. This one's just about asking questions about, Tucker talked about this a minute ago, about, hey, can we go just ask Mike Pompeo some questions? Can we ask Bill Barr some questions under oath? Why do we have to start with an indictment? Can't we just get them under oath and ask them questions about where their name shows up and what this is all about? And I think that's a pretty small ask. I mean, the FBI, like Ian Carroll said, the word investigation is in the name, Federal Bureau of Investigation. So do some investigating. How about? I mean, that's all really people are asking for at this point. All right, let's jump into this next clip.
Did anyone been asked about this? I mean, is it, a lot of the people in these exchanges, or apparently in these exchanges, are still alive. Some of them are prominent people still, including apparently the doctor in this exchange. Do you know if anyone has just been asked in a straightforward way, what was this?
Not since Pizzagate, as far as I'm aware. I mean, to be fair, it's all a little new. We're still in the first week here, but no, I don't know of anyone being asked directly about any of these references or about any of the more overt stuff for that matter. The other very rich and powerful people that are caught with their pants down, so to speak here. A couple of people have issued apologies. A couple of people have, resigned from positions, but it's entirely underwhelming, the official response, because it's one thing for someone like you or me, journalists, to go and ask questions, which is good and should be happening. But that's not what should be happening. What should be happening is law enforcement should be at their door knocking and asking these questions. Like, we should have institutions that are there asking these questions and many more. This is a particularly interesting and dark thread when you really unwind it. But there's obviously all the other threads of just like, hey, you went to the island. Hey, you said you never talked to him, but you did. So, and none of those questions are being asked. We're being told that it's all a Democrat hoax and that Kash Patel would arrest someone if there was anyone to arrest. So it's very underwhelming.
Yeah, I mean, I always am suspicious of people who jump ahead to things like arrest, conviction, incarceration, execution. Like, how about let's just start with an interview? And, I know a lot of people who've been interviewed by the FBI. I know hundreds of people who've been interviewed. Well, exactly. But in the context of a federal investigation, it's not crazy to call somebody. In fact, it's common. It happens every single day. Happened to every relative of every J6 prisoner. Got called in, sat down. Can we come talk to you? I mean, that's not weird. That's the beginning of justice. That's the first step in finding out what happened, punishing the guilty, exonerating the innocent, is having these conversations in the context of a federal investigation, like an FBI interview. And I find it very strange that none of this has happened. And so when you see people on television say, well, we don't have any evidence to indict someone or panel a grand jury, it's like, I don't know. Who talked about a grand jury? Why don't you just ask questions you're the FBI? And if they're not doing that, then you sort of wonder why. So so here's the bigger picture.
One of the things that I think about when I hear this is I think about, he mentioned J6, January 6th people, all these, like 1,200 people went to jail, went to prison, some of them for like 4 years. And, it's interesting when you look at the government and what they choose to prosecute. They choose to prosecute a bunch of business owners and working people that thought, okay, this is very key, they thought they had a right to go redress their government for grievances. And it turns out, you don't have that right. At least you don't have that right inside Washington, D.C. And this is not the first time this has happened. The bonus war after World War I in 1932, this was a big deal where the government promised all these guys bonuses and for participating in the war, for being soldiers in the war, and then they kind of reneged on that. And so all these guys that were in World War I, marched on Washington, D.C., and they were camped out for weeks living in Washington, D.C. I mean, didn't have jobs. It was during the Great Depression. And, the government just came in the Army came in. People like Patton and Eisenhower and MacArthur were all involved in this and just burned down the little camp city and threw tear gas and literally rolled tanks in. And so the government, it has its things it likes to prosecute, but it never likes to prosecute itself. When you look back at something like Watergate, that was such a rare thing. And it mostly, I think, had to do with, this is going to sound conspiratorial, but, Nixon was not a big fan of his Israeli buddies. And magically, right there afterwards, here comes Watergate. But notice what happened. That's another story, but notice what happened during Watergate. People were asking questions. Reporters were asking questions. People inside the government were asking questions. And they dug until they got to the bottom of it. Nobody's digging here. Nobody's asking questions. Nobody's even attempting to be interested in this. In fact, we get just the opposite. What? You're still talking about that guy, Jeffrey Epstein, that creep? And Pam Bondi, she's on video talking about how there's millions of hours of video of children being raped and abused, but there's nothing to see here. It's just a bunch of kiddie porn or something. I don't know. It's just very bizarre, but to me, it fits perfectly in the category of the government just doesn't want to look at itself. They're all in this club. I won't look at the bad shit you do if you don't look at the bad shit that I do. And they all have this kind of gentleman's agreement. And, but boy, I tell you what, like he said earlier, you smoking a joint or you going 5 miles and over the speed limit, it's woo, you got to go to court, got to pay a fine, you got to defer to adjudication, and we reserve the right to prosecute you further and all this bullshit. It's just interesting to look at the government and see what it really focuses on with respect to criminal activity. It doesn't focus at all, not even a little bit, on the criminal activity that's happening inside the government. All of its focus is on you and me. And there's just got to be something to that, right? There's an element of, these laws are not for thee. They're not for me. They're for thee. That kind of thing. And it's got to be some part of the bigger control scheme or something. I don't know. But it's just interesting to look and notice that the things they prosecute the hardest are on citizens. If you, like Julian Assange didn't leak information himself. He didn't steal information from the U.S. government. He simply took information that somebody else took and he published it. Well, how is that different than what the Washington Post did with the Pentagon Papers? It's not different. But yet Julian Assange is being called, he's guilty of treason, and they want to bring him back to the United States and prosecute him for the sedition and treason acts and things like this. And so, and meanwhile, there's people committing treason within the government. These latest allegations of Barack Obama are pretty damn damning, where they took the intelligence community briefing that said that Russia didn't have much of an impact on the 2016 election, and before it got released to the public, Barack Obama calls a meeting with like Susan Rice and James Clapper and John Brennan and people and Jim Comey and people like this, and gets them to agree that, yeah, we can't put this assessment out because we want to cripple Trump's presidency. This is after Trump was elected, but before he took office. They changed the intelligence community briefing from saying that Russia did interfere, but it didn't have much impact on the outcome, to Russia interfered and it likely had a significant impact on the outcome. What the hell is that if that's not treason? You know, I mean, so I don't know, man. There's just, you know, it's like everything else. It's upside down world, you know. They're hot on the trail after you for committing misdemeanors, but these high treasonous things that people traditionally are put to death for, there's nothing. There's no conversation. There's no questions. There's just people walking around free, like Mike Pompeo and Bill Barr, and go on and on. There's hundreds. I mean, like Ian Carroll said, the list, every time you get one of these dumps, the list grows by like a mile, 100 miles. There's just a ton of people that are implicated in all this. All right, let's jump into the next clip. And this one's about something I've talked before about when people realize what this is all about, can America survive it? And I could totally relate to what Ian Carroll was saying here, and this very much encapsulates the way I feel about all this. You just cannot have a free society with all this kind of shit going on. You just can't have it. And people have to be prosecuted. They have to be stood up in front of the world and shown to be a criminal, the criminals that they actually are. And then they have to be punished. Otherwise, this just continues forever and you never get rid of it. And so they're going to talk a little bit about that, which I think is really interesting and really, you know, drove the point home for me.
So here's my big picture concern is that all these, our country and the entire West, you know, the structure is representative democracy, some version of that, like the people rule. And it is therefore, these are all voluntary systems. Like people participate in the system, they pay their taxes, they obey the law, they vote, they abide by the results of those elections. Like all of this is just voluntary because we all believe that despite corruption and imperfection, the systems themselves are legitimate. They're kind of run on the basis of what they tell us they're doing. Like this is all for our benefit. If people decide that like it's all fake, it's all totally corrupt, our welfare has nothing to do with why these systems are running, it's all like a scam, I don't know, like what happens then? When you know this much about the corruption, can any of these systems continue? And I should just say, for whatever it's worth, it, I like a lot of these systems. I grew up with them. Like I'm for democracy. I'm for, you know, transparent justice and all that stuff. I'm not for tearing it all down, but I'm starting to wonder, like, can any of this keep going now that we know a lot of the truth?
Yeah, that is the $1 million question. And so I'm 33 years old right now, and I'm sort of the 9/11 generation. And
yeah,
I shudder to imagine how a 21-year-old must feel today,
yes,
or a 15-year-old must feel today, because even at my age, as sort of like a still younger kind of adult, moving into, like, my generation is supposed to be moving into leadership roles and moving into positions of taking on the mantle of like leading our country in the next, 5 to 10 years. And we all grew up in this world where the first thing we knew as like young thinking adults was 9/11. And every event since then has felt like a facade. It's all felt like lies. It's all felt like deception. And it's culminated in this moment where we get this massive dump of information that just explicitly tells us that all the way back to Bill Clinton's presidency, and even before in a lot of ways, our government has been blackmailed on behalf of a foreign, malign, malignant sort of an interest that then when we all see in 2019 that this guy gets charged, they get all this evidence, it is now 2026. That is 7 years of the American government doing absolutely nothing with this with this case, not prosecuting anyone except for Ghislaine a little bit, not asking any questions, no investigations, no, where like we're told that this is America. We're told that this is, the greatest country on earth. And what you would expect then from any decent country or any decent person, if you shrunk this down to a smaller kind of a frame of reference, is you would expect that you deal with it. You deal with it. You don't let people abuse children. You don't let people blackmail your politicians. You don't let people control your financial networks through coercion and bribery and control like this. And so when people in their 20s and 30s and everyone of every age sees that for decades now, our nation has been co-opted from the inside. And then when they find that co-option and then still nothing is done, in fact, it's actually actively covered up for almost 20 years now since the initial sweetheart deal. Yeah, I don't know how you come back from that. And that's where it feels a little bit more like, you remember that there's a famous tape that goes around of Yuri Bezmenov, I think his name is, describing KGB subversion of a nation and the stages of subversion. I kind of shudder to think this part of it all through, but it really does make me feel like almost like we've been cast from worth being controlled to now just being subverted. Because when you've been that deeply compromised for that long, it's almost reminds me of like the man that has let his values slip for so long, has been lost in the bottle for so long, or has been cheating for so long that once the lies all come out, once the pain all comes out, it's like there's no man left. There's no, which is like, that's an unacceptable state of being. That's an unacceptable answer. I'm trying to raise a family in this country. I'm trying to raise children. I'm trying to have a future. And so there, I think there's people at all different stages of grief with this thing and rage with this thing. And I think that maybe people that skew older maybe skew more towards like trying to ignore it. And I think that people that skew younger maybe also like giving up about it. But I'm somewhere in the middle where it's like rage, because this is like, we're supposed to have a future here. And I'm of the generation that's supposed to be here to do something about it. And everyone in, from my generation up to like Kash Patel's generation, for example, everyone of power, it seems to be just complicit or weak and spineless or unwilling to do something, unable to do something. So I don't know what the solution is, but it's just, it's unacceptable to me that there isn't one.
Yeah, man, I tell you what, this is exactly how I feel. I feel like, I've lived a good portion of my life, right? I'm almost 60, but I have children. I have adult children and I want them to have a good future. I can totally relate to what he said. I'm trying to have a future here. And this is kind of the way I feel about the money. How do you have a future when these people are in power? The very same people we're talking about here, by the way, are constantly, effectively stealing from you through the stealing of productivity, the productivity of your labor. How do you have that future? How do you secure that future? It's almost like, at some point, if this doesn't stop, we're all going to have to just become criminals, because that's the only way you can get ahead. There is no legitimate way to get ahead at that point. And man, this to me is very depressing. And I agree. I don't know how if you're 15 or you're 20 or you're his age 30. I don't know if you're red pilled. Okay. Now, if you're blue pilled and you still live in the matrix and you think everything's great, then I don't know what to tell you. There's nothing I can do to help you. Nothing anybody can do to help you. Just continue to live in the matrix. I don't know if you saw the Matrix, but remember the one guy made a deal to get put back in the Matrix. He was going to turn evidence on his buddies, and they were going to put him back in the Matrix. And he was just, in his mind, it was just better than living in reality. And so maybe that's the way people are. I don't know, but it's definitely, I think what you have to say here is it's definitely not like what we learned about in 8th grade history. I talk about that all the time, kind of tongue in cheek. Or, you know, when you watched I'm a Bill, I'm only a Bill, I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill, you know, the Schoolhouse Rock stuff, you know, that's not what America is. And the quicker we can collectively acknowledge that and understand that that's not the reality. Like there's people, like when these people, I talk about this all the time, where people come on TV and they talk about your vote and your vote is sacred and everybody needs to fight to the death for their right to vote or whatever. And I just laugh at that. I'm thinking, oh, okay, yeah, because voting gets you what you want? I don't think so. I mean, it's all just a big narrative to keep people asleep and not paying attention while they just raid the cookie jar, you know, sneak around in the middle of the night and steal from the rest of us. And that type of system cannot persist. I mean, it eventually ends up in chaos and war and, I don't know, just complete disarray, you know. I mean, we've got to prosecute. You know, my adult children and Ian Carroll's children and Tucker Carlson's children really just don't even have any hope in America if we cannot get this to stop, okay? It's got to stop. Now, I still contend that if you just go to honest money, and what does that mean? I mean, what does honest money mean? It just means money that the government can't create. That's all it means. Or nobody can create, right? Now, Bitcoin, you know, there is a way to create that, but there's a limit. And as you approach that limit, it gets harder and harder to create it. So it'd be like the metaphor would be like mining for gold, okay? And just assume that mining, to get more and more gold, you have to go deeper and deeper. And just imagine that costs more and more money. That's the way Bitcoin is. The more Bitcoin you try to make, the closer you get to that 21 million limit, the more expensive the electricity is, the more expensive just in general it is to mine that next marginal coin. So there is a limit to Bitcoin. And I'm not even sure Bitcoin is the answer. I'm not advocating that it is. I don't know. That's the whole point, is nobody knows what the answer is to honest money. But the best money emerges. That's how that works. And so you got to get rid of the legal tender laws. You got to get rid of the monetary authorities and stuff like that, the Federal Reserve. And you get rid of the legal tender laws and let anybody trade whatever money they want. And eventually the most honest money will emerge. That's how it works. But, you know, to me, if you did that, then all this other stuff just goes away. It really just comes to an end, because once you take away this small group of people's ability to, it's not that they can print the money, but they're all buddies with the people that can. They're all in it together. They're all kind of scratching each other's back, and they're close to this printing press. Jeffrey Epstein was close to the printing press, and he was able to get even closer than some people could get because he had blackmail dirt on so many people. And to me, you got to drive a wedge right into this thing. You got to have a huge perp walk. And if you don't, there's just no hope for America to continue to exist. I think the best thing you can hope for at that point is that we all just break up into 50 states. So anyway, I'll put some stuff in the show notes page. I'll put this interview, but I'll also put, there's a couple clips I saw that I thought were really good, of just people being frustrated online and talking about their frustrations. And there's really talented people online that put together these kind of a collage of videos and things like that. I'll put a couple of those things online, but hopefully we'll start to see more and more information come out about these Epstein files, because it is, I think, going to have an effect that it picks the lock in terms of explaining why life is getting so much harder for so many people, why young people can't afford homes, there's a lot there that's explained. And then the biggest one of all is, why can't we control our representatives? Why don't they seem more interested in our well-being? Why do they seem to be interested in Israel's well-being or the CIA's well-being or their own well-being? Why do they just get to trade stocks with impunity while they're making $175,000 a year, Elon Omar's in Congress for 5 years. I can't remember what her net worth was, but her net worth when she started was like $50,000. Now it's way in the millions, like $20, $30 million. How is that possible without breaking some rules? It's just, the answer is it's not. Okay, it's not possible to make $175,000 a year and in 5 years be worth $20 million or $30 million or whatever she's worth. That's not possible. Okay. And instead of ignoring it, instead of saying, oh, well, what are you going to do? You know, we collectively, Americans, need to get to the bottom of this. We need to keep the pressure on these politicians until they start asking questions and start investigating it. And then once they do that, the media will take over, and because they won't want to be on the outside of the story once it gets started. But somebody's got to start, and I'm glad Tucker's doing it. I'm glad Ian Carroll's doing it. All right, with that, I'm going to wrap up. Thank you guys for coming in and listening today. Share the show. If you listen mostly, go to YouTube and like and subscribe the show. Maybe watch one of the shows on YouTube to get the algorithm working. And most importantly, just come back and check in on us again in 3 or 4 days, and we'll have a new episode on Who Gets to Decide. All right, everybody, I'm out. Peace.